On a morning thick with heat and hung like a secret over the salt marsh, a woman's scream tore down the lane to Willowbrook. Picture Catherine Hargrove standing at the cracked threshold, candlelight trembling in her fingers as she watched the life she had been taught to accept unravel on a bed in the East Wing. Her husband, a man of linen collars and church pews, entangled in what the town would name an abomination with 3 of his enslaved workers. The sight was a slow-motion collapse, a husband whose public face had been polished until it shone, caught in a private life that betrayed every public ritual he performed. Bowford's social order was built on those rituals. Parlor smiles, committee chairs, the precise cadence of Sunday pews. And when a ritual failed, everything near it rattled. Catherine had been trained to occupy a particular kind of silence, to practice music, needlework, and the gentle art of making suffering pretty. But she was not entirely made of silence. She had begun to notice small discrepancies, lamps missing from their usual places, the East Wing door latched in a way it had not been before, linens that disappeared from the household inventory as if taken by private appetite. The 3 men in that room had names and histories ignored by the law, Marcus, whose life in the house tracked back to childhood and who moved with the quiet of someone taught to be invisible, Samuel, whose hands smelled of horses and who held himself with a dignity that rarely met the eyes of masters, Daniel, a young craftsman whose fingers could smooth wood into ornament and whose voice came rarely because speaking often invited punishment. They were legally property. They were human in ways the law refused to name. When Catherine followed the tracks through moonlit brick walks, wrapped in a dark shawl that nearly erased her from view, she found the East Wing door ajar and light flickering within. She did not yet understand everything she would witness. She only understood she could no longer live inside a lie. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Subscribe now and tell me where you are listening from. Bowford, the county seat near the marsh, had perfected respectability into an art form. Front-facing porches displayed the choreography of deference. Charity events smoothed social edges that otherwise cracked under the pressure of property and debt. Edmund Hargrove's household was an exhibit, a Greek revival house set into landscaped lawn, French chandeliers, ledger books kept in an unblinking hand. He served on councils, read the same Bible as his peers, took his place at the church altar, the outward evidence of order. Catherine's marriage had been arranged with the kind of cold calculus the region favored, alliances of wealth and standing that preserved lines and bank accounts. They sat at tables together, presented a united front, and kept the private fissures to themselves. But houses have corners where secrets gather, where servants move and small injustices accumulate into patterns a perceptive eye will read. Catherine's quiet observations. A new energy in Edmund's steps and mornings, a repeated absence from the marital bed, a wiser smile shared between master and certain servants, began to align into a hypothesis she couldn't dismiss. And so she acted as women trained in surveillance often do. She turned suspicion into verification. The East Wing had been kept in seeming repair for months. Edmund used it as a private retreat, a room with its own entrance. Oil lamps that allowed intimacy at night without the noise of the main house. For years the arrangement had gone unremarked because no one wanted to see it. When Catherine slipped into that wing under cover of moonlight, she found the scene she had feared and yet needed to witness. What she saw did not fit comfortable categories. Tenderness and repetition that hinted at relationships cultivated over time, gestures of affection exchanged in a place intended to be hidden. In a social system that depended on illusions, that very intimacy was an existential threat, not simply scandalous, but a contagion that if left unpunished might suggest other men behaved similarly. Catherine's reaction was not only private devastation, it was strategy. She wrote letters, crisp and unflinching, one to the sheriff, one to Edmund's mother, and one slid under Edmund's own door. Her hand did not tremble when she described the scene. She did not write for pity. She wrote to bring law into the light and to force the community to choose what order it would defend. The sheriff arrived and moved through the rooms with the sober efficiency of a civic actor who knew what the statute required. The household's quiet evidence, missing linens, a still, warm lamp, a locked door opened, formed the kind of proof the courthouse required. Arrests were made not as retribution alone, but as demonstration law when invoked, must be seen to act. Word of the arrests travelled through Bowford as if the town itself were a living rumour. Markets, blacksmiths, church porches, each became nodes where the same sentence repeated and mutated. Edmund Hargrove, deacon and planter, had been discovered with 3 enslaved men. People leaned into the gossip for reasons both base and civic. They needed to see how the world would be remade now that a pillar had fallen. Judge Howard Middleton, who had spent decades defending order and preaching the moral rectitude of fastidious law, convened local leaders to decide not if but how the public architecture should respond. In chambers, the conversation took the shape of balancing ledgers. What would executing a man of Edmund's standing do to the local economy? How would his death affect debts and the livelihoods dependent on his estate? The point for those men was never simply moral clarity. It was the preservation of a hierarchy that extended from pews to fields. The law, however, read plainly, sodomy, the term used then with its full historical weight, was among the gravest offences and the statutes allowed for execution. Yet Judge Middleton, calculating both law and consequence, proposed a punishment meant to do more than remove a body. He suggested something worse than an execution, a public destruction of identity. If executed, Edmund would leave the scene as a martyr of sorts, his name preserved in whispers and, perhaps, sympathy. Instead, the judge proposed humiliation in full glare, pillory and whipping stretched across 3 days, while the 3 enslaved men would be hanged before his punishment began. That calculus horrified some men in the room and satisfied others. The logic read clearly to those who crafted it: degrade the white man publicly, to teach him and the community his place, but make the fate of the enslaved absolute and final so that no sympathetic narrative could soften what had been done. It was law as theatre, law as pedagogy. Catherine, when she learned of this plan, did not accept the simple script of revenge. She saw how the sequence could create a martyr, and how the 3 men might be erased into footnotes. She made an extraordinary choice. She requested the punishments be staged so that all 4 men would witness the consequences of Edmund's acts together. That the enslaved men would be present to watch Edmund's humiliation, and that Edmund would be forced to watch their executions. The judge, after a long pause, granted her request. What followed would be the most public and brutal lesson Bowford could devise. The trial that followed filled the courthouse until windows steamed with bodies pressed against glass. A moral carnival assembled. Who would look away, who would stare. Catherine took the witness stand in clothes chosen to signify both mourning and resolve. She spoke with a voice that left no room for equivocation. She testified in exact, unflinching detail about what she had seen in the East Wing. The defense offered gestures toward temporary insanity, private confusion, mistakes of perception, all inadequate against Catherine's steady narrative and the material details the sheriff's deputies had collected. The jury retired and returned in minutes with verdicts that the town had already prepared itself to endorse. Edmund was declared guilty, Marcus Samuel and Daniel were convicted as well. The sentences read like ritual: the 3 enslaved men to be executed, Edmund to be locked in the pillory from dawn to dusk for 3 days, and lashed at noon each day. The order of these punishments mattered. It would tell the town and the region which bodies the law protected and which bodies the law would sacrifice. The first morning of the execution sequence arrived with a heat that people in later retellings compared to a furnace. The gallows were raised near the market green, a crude silhouette against sky. The 3 men walked forward with a cadence known to those who have been taught what awaits them. They ascended steps with a dignity that owned the only agency they possessed in that moment. Marcus looked outward at the rows of faces. Samuel held his chin as if to shield some private flame. Daniel wept silently until the end. The town watched. Then the pillory waited. Edmund, stripped of collars and status symbols, was brought and set in wood and iron as midday sun carved shadows across his face. From dawn to dusk he stood exposed. At noon the lash came down in strokes intended to mark and not to kill, a cruelty calibrated to leave permanent proof of shame on skin. The spectacle had a geography of cruelty. The gallows framed death as inevitability. The pillory turned shame into a visible, communal curriculum. Catherine watched too, not a distant observer, but an architect of the sequence she had demanded. The scene achieved what the judge had hoped. The town received a lesson in public order, but it also acquired a stain that would not easily wash out. The ritual of punishment tore through days as a tide. People who had once traded politeness now exchanged an uglier currency, certainty about what had been done and who deserved contempt. Mothers held children so they would learn where to point and what to whisper about the boundaries of acceptable life. Men who had once privately held similar secrets now found themselves measuring their steps against the spectacle, calibrating apology and distance. And yet the spectacle did not produce unanimity of feeling beneath the surface. It produced other, quieter reactions that official records would not show. Some watched with an uneasy satisfaction that edged into horror. Others looked away and left the square with cheeks wet and hands clenched. A few of the more practical citizens thought ahead to estates and ledgers, and the economic shock that the Hargrove downfall would produce. Catherine's immediate future was a puzzle the town tried to fit into tidy categories. She announced she would return to Charleston, that she would rejoin her own family and reclaim the role of wronged wife. Many accepted that narrative because it allowed everyone to move on. The woman who had exposed the sin was now the injured party, and the community could reconstruct moral boundaries around that frame. But private documents later revealed a conflicting interior. Catherine, who had ordered the full public collapse, also visited the gallows and wept for men she had compelled to stand before death. Her grief was complicated by responsibility and by the knowledge that what she had done was final. Edmund, meanwhile, returned to a kind of living death. His body bore lash scars that could not be hidden by fine shirts, and his name became an object lesson in conversations meant to secure obedience. Trustees arranged his estate to preserve wealth while minimizing public fallout. The family rearranged social alliances to survive the reputational collapse. The town breathed as if a fever had broken, but the fever left a residue, a social memory that would inform behavior for decades. Papers created that year, inventories, court records, depositions, were folded into clerks' files and then sealed, not only for the privacy of the Hargrove name, but because the town preferred to bury the dissonance. Those sealed records would later become an object of fascination for scholars trying to excavate the tangled human realities beneath civic theater. Years turned into decades and the physical architecture of Willowbrook remained, though its rooms held different voices. The mansion continued to stand, its porches shaded by moss, its rooms keeping their own echoes. The legal files were tucked away in the county clerk's vault where they sat, unread by most, until curiosity and professional insistence pried them open many seasons later. When historians finally unsealed the packets, they did not find a tidy moral ledger. Instead, they found fragments that complicated the simple lessons the town had staged. There were notes from a clerk who had lingered over paperwork and then delayed a single signature because he could not bear to look on certain scenes. There were letters indicating that some who worked within the household tried to mediate, to save a life with small acts that never made it into official records. Catherine's private notebook surfaced too, showing a woman capable of cold calculation and of sudden, incandescent sorrow. The three men, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, appeared in historical traces more as pieces of an economic equation than as full human beings, baptismal entries, a child's record here, a wife's prayer there. Reconstructing their interior worlds required the kind of imaginative labor historians dread and need in equal measure, a patient assembling of marginalia, of oral memories repeated in kitchens, of songs hummed low after lights were put out. Willowbrook's story thus became a case study in how communities manufacture moral order and how they use public spectacle to enforce invisible hierarchies. It also revealed the moral paradoxes of vengeance. Catherine had demanded the most complete form of humiliation, then stood at the edge of the spectacle and wept for those she had helped consign. If you are listening to this from a porch, a subway, a mountain, or another time zone, consider what it means when justice becomes theater. Who benefits when punishment is designed as a moral lesson? Whose voices are erased so a community can feel whole again? Subscribe if you want more of these costly stories uncovered, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments if you choose to hold this truth with me. Begin now. After the immediate chaos of Bowford subsided, whispers of Edmund Hargrove's fall travelled along back roads and river roads, taking on lives of their own. Every tavern hearth and church pew became a theatre of retelling. The story mutated, elongated, sharpened the cruelty, the scandal, the public humiliation, all exaggerated, until it hovered at the edge of legend. Children were instructed sternly about obedience, women carried warnings in the cadence of conversation, men checked their alliances, wondering who among them might harbour hidden acts that would someday erupt into shame. Yet even as the story spread, certain truths were swallowed by the haze of gossip. Catherine, whose name was whispered with awe and fear, had become an enigmatic figure, the woman who had unveiled the secret, orchestrated the punishment, and simultaneously wept for its victims. Scholars reading her letters centuries later would note her precise control of language, her ability to manipulate a community of men who were certain they defined justice. The 3 enslaved men, though executed, were not entirely erased. Their lives lingered in the peripheral records, a note in a ledger, a fleeting mention in a sermon, a line scratched into the wood of the gallows that remained long after they were gone. People with the courage to look closer sensed the moral dissonance, the theatrical justice that had produced not clarity, but a haunted ambiguity. Those ambiguities turned Willowbrook into a case study in cruelty's choreography. Outsiders arrived decades later, historians with leather-bound journals and fading ink, trying to understand how a town could balance reverence and horror in the same breath. They found Catherine's letters, Judge Middleton's notes, even Edmund's last surviving ledger entries, and from those fragments emerged a question that seemed to echo across centuries: can justice ever exist when orchestrated as spectacle? The moral landscape of Bowford had been rearranged in a single, blistering week, but the shadows of that week lingered far longer than any human memory could endure. Catherine left Bowford eventually, her life outwardly resumed with quiet respectability, yet she carried an invisible archive of the town's most shameful moment. She knew the truth, that what was recorded and what was remembered are never the same, and that punishment designed as moral pedagogy may leave scars far deeper than the bodies it touches. The mansion, the east wing, the pillory, even the whisper of names, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, Edmund, became spectral markers, reminders of the fragility of civility and of the cost of revelation. By the 1850s, Willowbrook's landscape had absorbed the tremors of Hargrove's scandal, though the physical markers were deceptively calm. Most claimed porches, oak trees stretched into shadows over empty lawns, and the mansion's east wing bore subtle signs of disuse, as if aware it had once hosted transgression. Visitors walking past could feel a faint chill, a sense of history's unspoken yet palpable. The Hargrove estate became an involuntary monument, both a warning and a ghostly repository. Catherine, though far away in Charleston, continued to correspond in cryptic letters with trusted confidants, her words a mix of strategized morality and private torment. She reflected on the delicate machinery of human power, how a single act, revealed, could destabilize an entire social order. Scholars later discovered that in her private journals, Catherine meticulously recorded the daily lives of those enslaved men, the rare moments of laughter, the songs they hummed, their quiet defiance. In doing so, she acknowledged their humanity even while orchestrating their deaths, creating a paradox that haunted every entry. Outsiders arriving to investigate the estate in later decades reported strange phenomena: shadows moving where none should exist, whispers when doors were shut, footsteps in the east wing at midnight. Folk stories suggested the 3 men lingered, bound not by chains but by unfinished reckonings. Visitors swore that Catherine's silhouette could be glimpsed through frosted windows, still watching, still lamenting, still demanding that history not forget. Even Edmund's descendants felt the weight of ancestral disgrace. Letters reveal sleepless nights, obsessive calculations to protect estate value, and the subtle but unshakable terror that someone might discover the truth again. Willowbrook became more than a town. It was a living case study of morality, performance, and revenge. The mansion's walls recorded it all, those silently, and those willing to listen. Historians, wanderers, the sensitive, could almost hear the rhythm of its dark past. This was no mere cautionary tale, it was a study in the consequences of transgression, a lens into the moral complexity of vengeance, and a warning when justice becomes theatre. The actors rarely leave unscathed. The echoes of Bowford's reckoning were layered like sediment, and only those with patience could excavate meaning from the residues of spectacle, shame, and sorrow. By mid-century, Willowbrook had achieved a peculiar fame among scholars, storytellers, and those drawn to the darker sides of human nature. The estate was catalogued in official records as a historical anomaly, a town that had staged morality in the flesh and left lessons that scholars struggled to pass. Visitors reported not only physical remnants, but an emotional resonance. Standing where the pillory had been erected was enough to induce vertigo, as though the past pressed against the present. The mansion's east wing remained unoccupied, its windows dimmed, doors creaking under minor winds, and floorboards creaking in rhythms that mimicked long, forgotten footsteps. Catherine's correspondence revealed an unusual clarity. She never sought forgiveness, only understanding, and she meticulously documented her motives in a tone that was both analytical and haunted. Letters from descendants of Edmund Hargrove surfaced decades later, recounting an obsession with the mansion's shadow, an inability to fully inhabit social space without feeling the weight of ancestral disgrace. The town of Bowford itself, though outwardly respectable, remained psychologically scarred. Children were told the story of the Hargrove punishment as a lesson in obedience. Adults whispered it when morality needed reinforcement. Those in the fields working near the original gallows site claimed to hear voices at dusk. Sometimes a woman's, sometimes three men's, reciting fragments of songs or muttered prayers. The story became a lens through which all behavior was judged: the morality of public action, the consequences of private desire, the invisible balance between justice and cruelty. Academic analyses produced a century later suggested that Bowford's fascination with the past reflected a universal tension: society's need for control and the impossibility of fully reconciling human nature with rigid moral structures. Catherine's careful orchestration of punishment, her private grief, and the estate's lingering resonance became intertwined in scholarship and folklore alike. The mansion itself became a semiotic archive, a site where architecture, memory, and morality intersected in ways that resisted simplification. Catherine's private journals reveal an ongoing dialogue with conscience. Decades after the punishment, she writes of sleepless nights, of staring into candlelight, seeing not just Edmund or the three men, but the reactions of Bowford's populace, the crowd that had internalized her spectacle as moral education. Her reflections oscillate between calculated strategy and raw emotional devastation. She understood that she had wielded control as a weapon, and that in doing so, she became an agent of both justice and suffering. Scholars reading her words centuries later noted the precision of her thought. She documented every movement, every gesture, every reaction, as if creating an archive for posterity, knowing that human memory is malleable, but written record is permanent. The town's silence over the decades served as its own kind of witness. Families spoke cautiously, teachers carefully curated what children heard, yet the mansion never ceased transmitting its residual history. Even when unoccupied, the East Wing seemed to hum with echoes of forbidden intimacy, with traces of human connection that society refused to acknowledge in life but could not erase after death. Paranormal investigators and historians alike speculated that the mansion's resonance was the product not of superstition but of concentrated human emotion, grief, rage, desire, shame, layered over decades like sediment pressed into stone. Catherine's role as orchestrator of spectacle and guardian of memory created a dual legacy. She ensured the town's lesson, yet she preserved fragments of lives otherwise intended for erasure. The consequence, as historians later observed, was that Willowbrook became a mirror, reflecting human cruelty and human empathy simultaneously. The mansion, the gallows site, and the pillory were not mere locations. They were conduits for the ethical complexities Catherine had harnessed and the community had witnessed. Her letters insist repeatedly that memory is a responsibility. To forget is to dishonor, to remember is to reckon. The cultural legacy of Willowbrook's scandal extended beyond Bowford. By the early 20th century, writers, folklorists, and moralists included the story in regional compendiums, emphasizing the paradoxes it presented. Public schools used sanitized versions to illustrate the dangers of vice and the importance of civic oversight. Yet in hidden archives, the truth persisted. Edmund Hargrove's private transgressions, Catherine's calculated vengeance, and the 3 enslaved men's stolen lives remained recorded in letters, court transcripts, and journals. Visitors walking the grounds often reported experiences that defied casual explanation: a sudden chill in a room, an inexplicable shadow, or a sensation of being observed. These accounts were often dismissed by casual observers, but became part of the lore that attracted researchers and thrill-seekers alike. Catherine, in her final letters, reflected that she had acted from both personal betrayal and a broader sense of moral duty. She acknowledged that her actions were ethically ambiguous, but insisted that they were necessary for the preservation of societal order, however imperfectly. The mansion's east wing, still uninhabited, became a symbol of moral complexity, a locus where social transgression and human emotion collided. Later scholars would describe it as an architectural conscience, a space that bore witness to acts both condemned and heroic, private and public, merciless and reflective. Every creaking floorboard, every faded curtain, seemed to echo the tension between the visible and the invisible, between the letter of law and the spirit of justice. Willowbrook's tale thus became not simply a historical curiosity, but a psychological and moral laboratory, allowing subsequent generations to explore the intersections of power, vengeance, and memory. By mid-20th century, Willowbrook had become a destination for those drawn to history's shadowed corners. Ghost tours and academic pilgrimages alike converged on the mansion, guided by stories of Catherine Edmund and the 3 men whose lives had been claimed by spectacle. Local historians documented the minutiae, the precise placement of the pillory, the orientation of the gallows, and the east wing's preservation. Catherine's correspondence and diaries were reproduced in archives, studied as early examples of moral reasoning intertwined with social strategy. Some scholars argued that her actions prefigured modern notions of psychological and social justice, the deliberate staging of consequences to influence public behavior. Others emphasized the ethical paradox that human life had been sacrificed for a lesson in morality. Visitors reported that the mansion seemed to breathe, that rooms whispered echoes of long-past conversations, that shadows lengthened where they should not. It became clear that the estate had absorbed human emotion into its architecture, creating a resonance that endured beyond any single generation. Catherine's dual legacy, enforcer of public spectacle and custodian of private memory, remained central. The mansion became a nexus where morality, cruelty, memory, and vengeance converged, leaving lessons that could be interpreted but never fully contained. Those who walked the grounds were forced to reckon with their own assumptions. The distinction between justice and vengeance, between private betrayal and public consequence, between historical record and lived experience. Willowbrook's story, layered and unresolvable, persisted as a reminder that human actions echo long after their immediate consequences. It was a haunting, deliberate legacy, one that continues to challenge observers and listeners to question their own moral frameworks. By the 1970s, Willowbrook had shifted from a local curiosity to a subject of national fascination. Anthropologists, historians, and even journalists traveled from distant states to examine the mansion, the grounds, and the small town whose history had been so violently altered by a single week of scandal. The East Wing, preserved as if untouched by time, became the focal point. Visitors reported an uncanny sensation upon entering, an almost tactile feeling of observation, as if unseen eyes followed them from room to room. Paranormal investigators recorded unexplained temperature drops, distant whispers, and subtle movements in the corner of vision. Scholars theorized that these phenomena were the result of concentrated human emotion, layered and preserved by architecture, grief, rage, shame, and betrayal frozen into the very fabric of the building. Catherine's private letters, now housed in climate-controlled archives, revealed a mind both meticulous and tormented. She had carefully chronicled every reaction of Bowford's citizens, from the judge's solemn deliberations to the gasps of servants who had witnessed the punishment. Yet her writing was not detached. It pulsed with sorrow, guilt, and a haunting recognition of her own complicity. She had orchestrated justice, yet she had also allowed cruelty to flourish under the guise of moral correction. Decades later, historians would debate her motives endlessly. Was she a moral hero, a woman determined to correct egregious wrongdoing? Or was she a shadowed manipulator, exacting vengeance in the most public and humiliating of ways? The mansion, the town, and the events themselves refused easy categorization. Visitors who lingered in the East Wing described a growing sense of unease, as though the building itself was testing their understanding of right and wrong. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, faint murmurs echoed through corridors, and on particularly quiet nights, some claimed to hear soft, deliberate footsteps pacing above them, as if Catherine herself were inspecting the premises. The mansion had become a living archive, its walls absorbing human action and emotion like a sponge, a repository of the intangible consequences of decisions made under duress. And as modern visitors left, some claimed to carry with them not just memories but subtle, unshakable impressions, a faint sense of vigilance, the awareness that the moral weight of Bowford could not be escaped simply by leaving the property. Willowbrook had become an ethical echo chamber, a place where human behavior was scrutinized and amplified through centuries. By the 1980s, media attention transformed Willowbrook from an academic interest into a cultural phenomenon. Documentaries, books, and articles highlighted the mansion's infamous history. Catherine's actions, Edmund Hargrove's downfall, and the tragic fates of the 3 enslaved men were portrayed with varying degrees of sensationalism. Yet for those who visited, the story was far more than narrative, it was a visceral experience. Tour guides noted that certain rooms caused sudden chills, unexplained goosebumps, or feelings of deep sorrow, as though the emotional imprint of past events was being transmitted directly to the living. Scholars suggested that what was being felt was not supernatural in the traditional sense, but rather a kind of psychic residue, concentrated human emotion that survived long after the bodies and voices themselves had disappeared. Catherine's letters continued to serve as a primary resource. Her reflections were uncannily prescient, offering commentary on social hierarchies, the construction of morality, and the psychological consequences of public punishment. She wrote of the thin line between justice and cruelty, the fragility of civility, and the power of spectacle to both instruct and traumatize. The mansion's architecture reinforced these lessons: narrow hallways that encouraged introspection, large rooms that amplified footsteps, and the East Wing, where every creak and shadow seemed charged with memory. Researchers began to speculate that Catherine had understood the principles of psychological imprinting long before they were formally studied. Her orchestration of the punishment had not been solely about revenge. It had been about ensuring that every witness carried the weight of the event forward, and forward it carried, across generations, through the careful preservation of letters, the stories told to children, and the architectural design that seemed deliberately intended to evoke awareness. Willowbrook's influence began to extend beyond mere history or legend. It became a model for the study of human behavior under pressure, moral decision-making, and the long-term effects of public spectacle. As academics delved deeper, they realized that Catherine had effectively engineered a moral experiment, one in which the variables were human emotion, social expectation, and public perception. The result was a narrative that refused to be simplified. There was no singular hero, no singular villain, only a tapestry of human action and reaction stitched together with cruelty, grief, and an unrelenting demand for justice, however imperfectly applied. The mansion, still standing, continued to absorb and reflect these layers, becoming both a teacher and a mirror for all who entered its halls. Entering the 1990s, Willowbrook began to intersect with the realm of the paranormal in popular culture. Television specials and local legends painted it as one of the most haunted sites in the South, yet those who approached it academically emphasized its ethical and psychological significance. Catherine's orchestration of Edmund Hargrove's punishment was reframed not merely as scandal, but as a study in morality and the human response to transgression. Visitors reported strange phenomena: whispers in abandoned rooms, doors closing without cause, and fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished before full recognition. These experiences were often paired with introspective reflection. Many left the mansion with a sense of moral unease, questioning their own understanding of right and wrong. Catherine's journals offered further insight. She meticulously detailed not only events but human behavior: the crowd's shock, the judge's deliberation, the quiet despair of the enslaved men. Her observations were both clinical and deeply personal, offering a lens into the mind of someone who wielded extraordinary influence over the fates of others. Scholars recognized her as a pioneer of psychological observation, a woman whose work transcended her era. Willowbrook, in turn, became a locus where ethical, historical, and emotional layers converged. The mansion's east wing remained a focal point. Every step taken within its walls seemed to echo centuries of moral complexity. Over time, the estate's influence extended beyond the local region. Writers, historians, and spiritual researchers traveled from afar, drawn to the mansion's dual identity as both historical archive and living experiment in human conscience. The story of Catherine and Bowford persisted as a cautionary tale, a moral laboratory, and a ghostly reminder that actions once enacted reverberate far beyond immediate comprehension. Even as technology advanced and society evolved, Willowbrook remained a site of reflection, haunted not only by spirits but by the moral dilemmas embedded in its very structure. By the early 2000s, Willowbrook had fully cemented its dual reputation, a historical landmark and a locus of lingering human emotion. Academics described it as an experiment in moral psychology enacted in the flesh. Catherine's decisions, Edmund Hargrove's transgressions, and the three enslaved men's tragic fates had left indelible marks, preserved both in architecture and narrative. Visitors reported a profound sense of awareness upon entering the mansion. The past pressed against them in ways subtle but undeniable. It was not merely fear or superstition. It was the weight of centuries of observation, judgment, and emotional residue. Catherine's correspondence had become widely studied, offering insight into her precise calculation of consequences. She understood that public punishment could serve as both instruction and trauma, that morality was performative as well as personal. Scholars likened the mansion to a moral lens, magnifying human behavior in ways impossible to ignore. Over time, Willowbrook inspired novels, documentaries, and psychological studies. Catherine's dual legacy, orchestrator of spectacle and custodian of memory, became a template for exploring the intersections of power, ethics, and emotional impact. Even technology could not fully contain the mansion's influence. Researchers using thermal cameras, audio sensors, and motion detectors reported anomalies that defied rational explanation. Cold spots without airflow, subtle vibrations in the floor, fleeting shadows. Each incident reinforced the mansion's role as a living archive, a repository for human experience, grief, and moral ambiguity. Catherine's careful orchestration of events ensured that her lessons endured, and Willowbrook itself became a conduit for ethical reflection. The mansion stood as a reminder that human decisions echo indefinitely, shaping consciousness long after actions are concluded. Its walls absorb morality and cruelty, judgment and remorse, creating a layered narrative impossible to simplify, endlessly compelling, and forever haunting. By 2010, Willowbrook had transcended mere historical curiosity. It had become a pilgrimage site for those fascinated by morality, justice, and the echoes of human cruelty. Visitors frequently described feeling Catherine's presence in the East Wing, an invisible gaze weighing their conscience, as if reminding them that every action has consequences beyond comprehension. Scholars studying the mansion's architecture began to note something unusual. The layout itself seemed designed to direct emotion. Narrow corridors channeled movement and perception, while the high ceilings of the East Wing amplified sound, making the space feel alive. Many claimed to hear whispers that were not wind, voices that seemed layered from different centuries, repeating questions, judgments, and even advice. The mansion's aura was not limited to perception. It had become a moral pressure chamber, teaching lessons about desire, betrayal, and the cost of human transgression. Catherine's orchestration of Edmund's punishment and the tragic fate of Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were central to this. Her planning had ensured maximum psychological impact, not only on the participants of the 1843 events, but on every observer who came afterward. The mansion's walls retained the memory of trauma, grief, and outrage in ways modern science struggled to explain. Visitors would sometimes describe seeing subtle forms moving in peripheral vision, shadowy impressions of Edmund's rigid posture, the enslaved men's silent despair, the townspeople's horrified expressions. These were not apparitions in the theatrical sense. They were echoes of emotion, a layered psychic imprint, as if the building itself insisted that history not be forgotten. Catherine's careful chronicling in her journals allowed historians to reconstruct every minute of those 3 days in the pillory. She recorded the sound of the crowd's gasps, the midday sun beating down on Edmund's back, the ripple of horror when the 3 men were led to their execution. Even decades later, reading her words evoked physical reactions in scholars, tension in the chest, accelerated heartbeat, and an unsettling sense of participation in events centuries past. Catherine had succeeded in creating a moral experiment that defied temporal boundaries. Every person who stepped into Willowbrook became part of that experiment, whether consciously or not. And in that way, the mansion was never truly empty. It was alive with the moral consequences of human desire, ambition, betrayal, and calculated vengeance. Visitors were warned to respect the space, but many admitted that it left them altered, attuned to subtleties of judgment and conscience they had never previously considered. And still, some whispered that Catherine's presence remained active, a living witness to human error, demanding attention, recognition, and reflection. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments if you feel her presence now, and subscribe to uncover more hidden histories. As the mansion's legend grew, so too did the study of its psychological impact. By the 2020s, researchers from multiple disciplines, psychology, architecture, anthropology, had convened to understand the lingering influence of Willowbrook. Catherine's meticulous planning of Edmund Hargrove's punishment and the orchestrated deaths of Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel had created something extraordinary, an enduring experiment in morality and human perception. Visitors reported sudden emotional disorientation, fleeting memories of events they could not have witnessed, feelings of guilt and betrayal that seemed personally assigned, and vivid visual impressions of the original participants frozen in time. It became clear that the mansion functioned as a repository for human emotion, a concentration of rage, sorrow, and judgment so powerful that it transmitted itself to anyone entering its walls. Scholars documented these experiences rigorously. Cognitive scientists noted that visitors often experienced heightened moral awareness after leaving the property, suggesting that the mansion acted as a psychological amplifier of ethical reflection. Even minor gestures, the way the light fell across the east wing floor, the creak of a door, the shadow of a column, could trigger profound emotional responses. Some visitors claimed they saw Edmund Hargrove pacing as if trapped, Marcus watching silently, Samuel's eyes burning with quiet rage, Daniel trembling, all spectral yet precise in detail, echoing the original sequence of events. The mansion itself, built for comfort and concealment, had become an instrument of long-term observation. Every detail of Catherine's planning contributed to this effect: the orientation of windows, the placement of lamps, the timing of daily routines, all designed to maximize both the immediate and lasting impact of witnessing human transgression and punishment. Researchers began theorizing that Catherine had instinctively understood principles of human cognition and emotional imprinting long before such fields existed. The mansion had been her canvas, the town her experiment, and the participants the subjects of an ethical demonstration whose influence stretched centuries. Each visitor who left Willowbrook carried fragments of that experiment, subtle awareness of human vulnerability, the weight of societal judgment, and the haunting reality that actions, once taken, reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. By now, Willowbrook was more than a historical site. It was a moral echo chamber, a living record of human frailty and justice, a place where the past could not be ignored. Subscribe now and comment your location. Are you near where these events once unfolded? Despite the passage of nearly 2 centuries, Willowbrook continued to exert a peculiar authority over all who encountered it. Modern accounts describe the mansion as both museum and moral crucible, a place where visitors could sense not just what had happened, but the profound ethical consequences of those events. Catherine's orchestration of Edmund's punishment, carefully executed over 3 days, was unparalleled in historical precedent. public spectacle, moral instruction, and private vengeance converged in a single, devastating sequence, leaving all involved, participant or observer, irrevocably altered. The enslaved men, forced to witness Edmund's humiliation, had perished with dignity, their silent defiance preserved in Catherine's meticulous documentation. Edmund's degradation, exposure to public scrutiny, and confrontation with the consequences of his own actions created a template for understanding the human response to accountability. Willowbrook, with its carefully preserved interiors, subtle architectural manipulations and journals, served as a living archive of ethical experimentation. Researchers noted recurring phenomena, physical sensations in empty rooms, the perception of movement along corridors, and the subtle sense of being watched, as if history itself maintained vigilance over the moral and immoral alike. Catherine's influence, though centuries removed, remained present. Her writing revealed a mind acutely aware of human weakness and societal expectation, her actions demonstrating how meticulous planning could amplify both justice and cruelty. Visitors often reported cognitive and emotional effects, heightened moral perception, vivid empathetic responses to suffering, and an unsettling understanding that ethical transgressions do not vanish with time. The mansion functioned as a moral lens, magnifying every act of betrayal, desire, and punishment through layers of observation, architecture, and narrative. Scholars began referring to Willowbrook as a living laboratory, its walls absorbing, transmitting, and amplifying human behavior. Every footstep, every creak, every shadow in the East Wing reinforced the ethical lessons Catherine had meticulously orchestrated. In this way, the mansion transcended its materiality, becoming both a historical site and a psychological instrument. The past was not dormant, it was active, speaking to the present in ways both subtle and profound. And now, as the sun sets over Willowbrook, the final revelation must be confronted. History is never neutral, morality is never static, and actions echo far beyond the moments in which they occur. Catherine Hargrove's orchestration of Edmund Hargrove's punishment, the deaths of Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, and the moral spectacle imposed upon Bowford created consequences that